The day Clara Hennessy buried her father was the same day she discovered she had nothing left in the world, and every soul in Dusthaven, Texas, stood on that sun-baked street and watched her fall apart without a single one of them moving an inch to help her. It was the autumn of 1878, and Dusthaven sat like a forgotten scar along the edge of the Texas Hill Country, a town of maybe 400 people who had carved their lives out of limestone rock and dry creek beds in stubborn, blistered will. The main street ran straight as a rifle barrel from the livery stable on the north end all the way to the church on the south, and everything that mattered in Dusthaven happened somewhere along that single dusty corridor. There was Harlan's General Store, where flour and gossip were sold in equal measure. There was the Silver Horn Saloon, which kept its doors open from noon until the last man fell off his stool. There was the telegraph office, the barber, the sheriff's station with its crooked iron bars, and right in the middle of it all, on a wooden bench outside the land deed office, sat Clara Hennessy, 23 years old, with her dark auburn hair pinned beneath a black mourning veil, crying as though the world itself had cracked open beneath her feet, which for her it very nearly had. Her father, Thomas Hennessy, had been the kind of man who built things. He had come to Dusthaven 18 years before with nothing but a mule and a leather satchel, and had slowly, patiently, stubbornly built a small cattle ranch on the eastern edge of town. He had raised Clara alone after her mother died of fever when Clara was just 7 years old, and he had done it with a steady hand and a warm laugh, and a belief that hard work would always, eventually, be enough. He had not been a perfect man. He had drunk too much whiskey in his younger years and had trusted the wrong people on occasion, but he had loved his daughter completely and without reservation, and that had always been the thing Clara counted on when everything else felt uncertain. He had died 4 days ago of a heart that simply stopped. No warning, no long illness, no chance to say goodbye. He had been out checking the north fence line and had come back to the house and sat down in his chair and never stood up again. The ranch hand, a quiet boy named Eli who was barely 17, had found him and had ridden into town for the doctor, but the doctor had arrived too late and had said there was nothing to be done. Clara had spent 4 days in a grief so total and so consuming that she had barely eaten, barely slept, barely spoken. And then on the 4th day, the lawyer had come. His name was Aldrich Coombs, and he was a thin, pale man with a narrow mustache and small eyes that never quite looked directly at the person he was speaking to. He had arrived at the ranch that morning with papers and a leather briefcase, and a smile that Clara had immediately distrusted without being able to say exactly why. And he had told her in his careful, measured way that her father had borrowed money against the ranch. A significant sum, borrowed 3 years prior from the Dusthaven Land and Cattle Company, which was, in all practical terms, a business enterprise controlled almost entirely by a man named Fletcher Goode. Fletcher Goode was the wealthiest man in Dusthaven, and had been for the better part of a decade. He had come to Texas from somewhere up north, Virginia or Maryland. Clara had never been certain, and he had arrived with capital and connections and an absolute willingness to do whatever was necessary to accumulate more of both. He owned shares in the Silver Horn, had a controlling interest in the grain mill, and had been quietly purchasing land throughout the county for years. He was a man who wore expensive suits and spoke in measured, reasonable sentences, and smiled in a way that never reached his eyes. Coombs had told Clara that her father's debt had come due 90 days ago, and that Thomas Hennessy had not made payment, and that the Land and Cattle Company therefore had the legal right to claim the ranch and all its assets. He had said this gently, with appropriate expressions of sympathy, and then he had handed her a document and told her she would need to sign it and vacate the property within 30 days. Clara had not signed anything. She had taken the papers and ridden into town and gone straight to the deed office to find out if what Coombs had told her was the truth, because her father had never mentioned any debt, and she could not make herself believe he would have borrowed against the ranch without telling her. The man at the deed office, a heavy-set fellow named Porter who sweated even in mild weather, had confirmed that yes, the lien was recorded, had been recorded 3 years prior, and that yes, the debt was substantial, and that yes, the company had every legal standing to proceed as Coombs had described. Clara had stood in that office for a long moment looking at the recorded document, at her father's careful signature at the bottom of it, and something inside her had simply given way. She had walked back outside into the bright October sunlight, sat down on the bench where she now sat, and begun to cry. Not quietly, not politely, but with her whole body, with shaking shoulders and a grief that went so far past the loss of land and property that it encompassed everything: her father, her mother, her childhood, the life she had known, the future she had imagined, all of it gone or going or already past. And the people of Dusthaven had watched. They had not been cruel about it. Nobody had laughed or pointed, but not one of them had crossed the street to sit with her either. Old Marta Ellison, who ran the dry goods store and had known Clara since she was a child, had looked over from her doorway with something like sympathy and then gone back inside. The two men outside the barber shop had glanced at her and then resumed their conversation. A woman with a basket of laundry had slowed her walk, looked, and then walked on. The sheriff, Dale Purvis, had come out of his office, looked at Clara for a long moment, and then gone back inside. Perhaps they did not know what to say. Perhaps they did not want to involve themselves in the complicated business between Clara Hennessy and Fletcher Good. Perhaps grief in the open air made people uncomfortable, made them feel that they were watching something too private, too raw, too honest for public consumption. Whatever the reason, the bench remained empty on either side of her, and Clara sat alone in her sorrow while the town moved carefully around her like a river bending around a stone. That was when the stranger rode in. He came from the North Road, which meant he had likely been traveling the hill country for several days. His horse was a tall roan mare with a white blaze on her nose, and the horse moved with the easy, long-strided confidence of an animal well cared for and well trained. The man himself rode with the kind of loose, unconscious competence that comes only from years in the saddle, upright but not rigid, relaxed but entirely alert. He wore a dark brown hat with a weathered brim, a canvas duster that had seen considerable hard use, and boots with enough Texas dust on them to suggest they had been walking this land for some time. He was somewhere around 28 or 29, broad through the shoulders with the lean, ropey build of a man who worked hard and ate whatever was available. His face was angular and weathered, with a jaw that had some stubble on it and eyes that were a very particular shade of gray-green, the color of sage after rain. His name was Caleb Daw, though the town of Dusthaven did not know that yet. He rode in slowly, the way a careful man enters a place he does not know, taking stock of the street and its inhabitants with unhurried eyes. He pulled up at the hitching post in front of Harlan's General Store, dismounted, looped his horse's reins with practiced ease, and then stood for a moment looking up and down the main street of Dusthaven. And he saw Clara. He saw her the way he saw everything, directly and without pretense. He saw a young woman alone on a bench, bent forward with her elbows on her knees and her face in her hands, crying with the kind of total, unguarded despair that people usually reserved for the privacy of their own rooms. He saw the way the townspeople moved around her without stopping. He saw the wide, empty space of the bench on either side of her. He took all of this in, and then he looked at the people who were not going to her, and something moved across his face, something quiet and definite. He crossed the street. It was maybe 30 yards of open ground, and he walked it in the same unhurried way he did everything else, not striding with dramatic purpose, not hesitating either, just walking toward her the way a person walks toward something they have already decided about. His boots made a soft sound in the packed dirt, and he stepped up onto the boardwalk and sat down on the bench beside her, leaving a respectful foot of distance between them, and he did not say anything. Clara had heard the footsteps. She had felt the bench shift when he sat. She lifted her face from her hands, expecting to see someone she knew, someone finally coming to say the words they thought might help, and she found herself looking at a complete stranger. She almost asked him what he wanted, or told him to leave her alone, or said something sharp and self-protective the way a person does when they are caught in their grief by an unexpected witness. But something about the way he was sitting stopped her. He was not looking at her. He was looking out at the street, his hands resting quiet on his knees, his posture easy and without demand. He had not sat down beside her in order to say anything in particular. He had simply sat down beside her so she would not be alone. Clara looked at him for a long moment, and then she looked back at her hands, and then she went back to crying, because the crying was not finished and this stranger did not seem to require her to be anything other than what she currently was. They sat like that for perhaps 10 minutes, the sound of her grief and the ordinary noise of the town moving around them, and the stranger did not speak and did not fidget and did not try to fix anything. Finally, Clara drew a long, uneven breath and pressed the back of her wrist to her eyes and straightened up. She looked at him again, this time more carefully. "I don't know you," she said. Her voice was rough from crying. "No," he agreed. "Name's Caleb Daw, I just rode in." "Clara Hennessy," she said, because it seemed like the right thing to say, even here, even like this. "Why did you sit down?" He considered the question for a moment as though it deserved genuine thought. "Seemed like a person ought not to be alone on a day like whatever today is for you," he said. Clara looked back out at the street. "My father died 4 days ago," she said, and her voice cracked on the last 2 words in a way she could not prevent. "And today I found out that a man named Fletcher Good owns my home now." Caleb did not react with pity or with alarm. He simply absorbed this information with the same quiet steadiness with which he had absorbed everything else. "I'm sorry about your father," he said. "He was a good man," Clara said, and she said it fiercely, the way you defend someone who can no longer defend themselves. "I believe you," Caleb said. They sat for another quiet moment, and Clara became suddenly, sharply aware of the fact that she had just told a complete stranger the outline of her most private disaster, and that this stranger had responded to it with a simplicity and a directness that somehow did not make her want to close off the way she usually would. She looked at him sideways, at the lines of his face and the worn leather of his hat and the quiet way his hands lay on his knees, and she said, "Are you passing through, or are you staying?" "Depends on what I find," he said. Clara almost smiled, which surprised her considerably. "Looking for work. Looking for the right kind of work," he said. "I've been up through the Panhandle and down through the hill country trying to find a spread that needed a top hand. Heard there was a ranch east of here that might be looking." Clara's chest tightened. "Hennessy Ranch," she said. "That's my father's ranch, my ranch." She stopped. "Or it was." Caleb turned to look at her directly for the first time since he had sat down, and she found that his gray-green eyes were very straightforward. "Tell me what happened," he said, and it was not a command or a polite inquiry. It was the simple statement of a person who had the time and the inclination to hear the truth of something. So Clara told him. She told him about her father, about the lawyer Coombs, about the lien and the land and cattle company and Fletcher Good, about the deed office and the recorded document with her father's signature. She told it all more clearly and more steadily than she had expected to be able to, because something about the way Caleb Daw listened made you feel that the words you were saying were worth the saying, that they were being received and held carefully on the other side. When she was finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Do you believe your father knew about the debt?" "I don't know what to believe," Clara admitted. "His signature is on the document, but he never told me, and he told me everything. A man sometimes takes on a debt he's ashamed of and keeps it quiet hoping he'll pay it off before anyone knows," Caleb said. "Doesn't mean the debt isn't real." "I know," Clara said, "but something about the way Coombs looked at me when he handed me those papers, something about the way he smiled," she pressed her lips together. I want to see those papers more carefully. I want to understand exactly what I'm signing before I sign anything." "That's wise," Caleb said. "You have a lawyer you trust." "The only lawyer in 100 miles is Coombs," Clara said, "and he works for good." Caleb nodded slowly. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, with a careful, unhurried consideration, "I knew a man in San Antonio who read law before he came out west. He settled in a place called Cedar Falls, which is about 2 days' ride from here. Man named Everett Pryor. He's honest, which I know because I've seen him refuse money he needed badly because he didn't like how it was offered." Clara looked at him. "You tell me how to find him." "I'd tell you more than that," Caleb said. "I'd ride with you if you wanted. I've got no particular place to be for the next few days, and the hill country is better company when you've got someone to ride with." Clara studied him for a long moment. She had been raised by a father who had told her to trust her gut about people, and her gut about Caleb Daw was saying something very clear and very certain. "Why would you do that?" she asked. "You don't know me." "I didn't know you 10 minutes ago either," he said. "And here we are." He said it simply, without any attempt at charm, just stating a fact about the way things had developed, and Clara found that she could not argue with it. "I need to go back to the ranch first," she said. "I need to get the papers and a change of clothes and arrange for Eli to look after the animals while I'm gone." "I'll be at the livery stable when you're ready," he said, and he stood up from the bench in that same unhurried, natural way he had sat down, and tipped his hat to her and walked back across the street. Clara watched him go. Across the street, at the door of the general store, she could see old Harlan himself watching with an expression somewhere between curiosity and disapproval. She did not care. She stood up, smoothed her skirt and squared her shoulders, and for the first time since she had read that recorded document, she felt something that was not quite hope but was at least the shape that hope might take when it returned. She went to get her horse. The ride to the ranch took 20 minutes on the eastern road, through oak and cedar scrub and the pale limestone outcroppings that gave this part of Texas its particular stern beauty. Clara rode ahead and Caleb rode beside her or slightly behind, and they talked in the easy, intermittent way of people who are comfortable with silence, but also interested in each other. She learned that he was from Missouri originally, that he had come south after the war, which had ended 13 years before but had left the kind of marks on people that do not simply disappear because a surrender has been signed. He did not say much about the war directly, only that he had been very young when it started and somewhat different afterward, which she understood to mean things she should not press on. He had worked ranches across Kansas and Indian Territory and the Texas Panhandle, and had spent 2 years as a trail hand on the Kishom Trail before deciding he wanted something that required him to be in fewer different places at once. Clara told him about the ranch, about the cattle herd her father had built up over 18 years, about the limestone spring that made the eastern pasture the best grazing land in the county, about the house her father had built with his own hands, adding rooms as he could afford to. She talked about him with such natural, specific love that Caleb could build a clear picture of Thomas Hennessy without having met him, a man who had been careful and stubborn and gentle, and sometimes infuriating and entirely devoted to his daughter. When they arrived at the ranch, Caleb dismounted and held her horse while she went inside. He did not come in uninvited, just stood in the yard with the horses and looked out at the land with the assessing eyes of a man who knows what good land looks like and can see that this is it. Eli was in the barn, a thin, dark-haired boy with an earnest face and a very serious manner for his age. He came out when he heard them and looked at Caleb with careful eyes. "This is Caleb Daw," Clara told him. "He's going to ride with me to Cedar Falls to see a lawyer about the papers Coombs brought. Can you manage here for 3 or 4 days?" "Yes, ma'am," Eli said with the gravity of someone who takes his responsibilities very seriously. He looked at Caleb again, measuring. "You're good with horses." "Reasonably so," Caleb said. Eli seemed to find this acceptable. He nodded and went back to the barn. Clara came back outside with a canvas saddlebag and the leather folder containing all the papers Coombs had given her, plus a tin box of her father's documents that she had found in his desk. She changed into riding clothes, practical and worn, and tied her hair back beneath her hat, and they set out south and west toward Cedar Falls in the long afternoon light. They camped that night on a limestone shelf above a creek, where the cedar trees made a windbreak, and the stars came out in such overwhelming numbers that the sky felt almost too large to look at directly. Caleb built a fire with the efficiency of someone who has done it 10,000 times in 10,000 places, and Clara made coffee in a tin pot that she had brought from the kitchen, because she was not going 2 days without coffee, and they sat on opposite sides of the fire in the comfortable dark and talked. They talked about things that had nothing to do with lawyers or ranches or men named Fletcher Good. They talked about books, because it turned out that Caleb Daw, who looked like nothing so much as a working cowboy, had read widely and retained almost everything, a trait his mother had given him along with her gray eyes. They talked about the places they had each been and the things they had seen. Clara described the summer she had spent in Austin as a girl, staying with a cousin of her father's who had taken her to the Opera House and the library and the State Capitol building, and how she had returned to Dusthaven feeling simultaneously broader and more tethered, as though the wider world had made her love her small world more. Caleb talked about the Comanche territory he had ridden through 3 years prior, the vast rolling grasslands of the Llano Estacado, and how he had been struck by the silence of it, the way the land simply went on and on without requiring anything from you. "Were you afraid?" Clara asked. "Riding through that country?" "Some," he said honestly. "But mostly I was just paying attention. Fear and attention are different things." Clara looked at him across the fire. The light moved across his face and made him look older and younger by turns. "You say things in a particular way," she said. "How do you mean?" "Like you've thought about them first," she said. "Before you say them. Most people talk first and think afterward." He almost smiled. It was a small thing, just a slight softening around his mouth and eyes, but it changed his face considerably, made it warmer. "My mother used to say that God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason," he said. "She sounds like she was a wise woman." "She was the wisest person I ever knew," he said, and there was something in his voice that told Clara she was gone, and that the loss of her was still present in him the way old losses are, not acute but always there, like a healed break in a bone that you feel when the weather changes. "I'm sorry," Clara said. "It was a long time ago," he said. But he said it gently, not dismissively, and she understood that he meant not that it no longer mattered but that he had made a kind of peace with it. They slept on opposite sides of the fire, wrapped in their own blankets, and Clara slept better than she had in 4 days, which surprised her when she woke in the pale gray pre-dawn and found the birds already beginning and the fire down to coals. Caleb was already up, crouched by the fire adding wood, with coffee already heating. He handed her a cup when she sat up, without ceremony, and she took it and wrapped both hands around it and breathed the steam and thought that very few people had ever done something that simple for her and had it feel so completely right. They reached Cedar Falls by midday of the second day, a town somewhat larger than Dusthaven, with a proper main street of brick buildings and a courthouse with a bell that was actually in the tower rather than propped against the outside wall the way Dusthaven's was. Caleb found Everett Pryor's office on a side street, a narrow room above a bootmaker, with a wooden sign painted in careful letters. Everett Pryor was a round, rumpled man in his late 40s, with silver spectacles and ink-stained fingers, and the sharp, unhurried eyes of someone who has spent a great deal of time reading documents that other people hoped no one would read carefully. He shook Caleb's hand and then Clara's, and he listened to everything Clara told him with his elbows on his desk and his fingers laced together, and then he spread the papers from the leather folder out on his desk and began to read. Clara and Caleb sat in the two chairs across from him and waited. Pryor read in silence for a very long time. He went back and forth between documents. He took off his spectacles and cleaned them and put them back on. He turned one particular page over and held it up toward the window. Then he put everything down very carefully and looked at Clara. "Tell me something," he said. "Does your father's signature look like this to you?" He pushed one of the documents across the desk toward her. Clara leaned forward and looked at the signature at the bottom. She had seen her father's signature hundreds of times on letters and accounts in the back of her childhood drawings when he had kept them, which he always had. She studied the signature on the document for a long moment. "It looks like his writing," she said slowly. "But something about it is different. The H in Hennessy. He always made the crossbar on the H very low. Almost like a lowercase. This one has the crossbar in the middle." Pryor nodded. He was looking at her with an expression of very controlled, very deliberate calm. "The notarization on this document is dated April 14, 1875, he said. "I want to show you something." He opened his desk drawer and produced a small almanac and opened it to a particular page and turned it so she could read it. "April 14, 1875 was a Wednesday," he said. "The notary stamp on this document belongs to a man named Samuel Crick, who served as notary in Dusthaven County until he retired." He paused. "Samuel Crick died on April 9, 1875, 5 days before this document was allegedly notarized." The room was very quiet. Clara looked at Caleb. Caleb was looking at Pryor with the same still, focused attention he brought to everything. "The signature is forged," Clara said. "Not a question." "I believe so, yes," Pryor said. "And the notarization is certainly fabricated. A dead man cannot notarize a document. This makes the entire lien legally void." He looked at her over his spectacles. "Miss Hennessy, someone went to considerable trouble to defraud you of your property." "Fletcher Good," Clara said. "I wouldn't say that name out loud in a court of law until we have considerably more evidence," Pryor said carefully. "But the document itself is sufficient to challenge the lien in court. If we can prove the signature is forged, the entire claim falls apart." He paused. "This will take time, and it will require you to file a challenge in the county court, which means you will need to remain in Dusthaven County and not sign any documents Coombs places before you." "I haven't signed anything," Clara said. "Good," Pryor said. "Don't." He gathered the papers back into their folder. "I can prepare the legal challenge from here and have it filed within the week. I will need you to provide a sworn statement about the signature, which I can take now. I will also need to establish the date of Samuel Crick's death, which should be in the county death records." He looked at her steadily. "Miss Hennessy, I will tell you plainly that a man like Fletcher Good will not accept this challenge without a fight, and a legal fight takes time and money. Do you have the resources to see this through?" Clara thought of the tin box she had taken from her father's desk, which contained approximately $60 in paper money and a list of accounts receivable from 3 ranches that had bought cattle from her father this past spring. "I have some," she said. "Not a great deal." "My fee for this work will be $40, Pryor said. "Payable when and as you are able. I am not asking for it now." Clara looked at him for a moment with the careful eyes of a woman who has just been told that a stranger intends to be generous to her and is not entirely sure she trusts it. "Why?" she asked. Pryor smiled, and it was a real smile, the kind that reaches the eyes. "Because document fraud of this nature is an injustice," he said. "And because Caleb Daw vouched for you, and in my experience his judgment about people is about as reliable as anything I know." He looked at Caleb. "Been a while, Daw." 3 years, Caleb said. "You look the same." "I look older," Pryor said. "Same thing," Caleb said, and Pryor laughed. They took Clara's sworn statement that afternoon, Pryor writing it out in his careful hand and Clara signing it. And then they stayed the night in Cedar Falls at the boarding house on the main street, separate rooms. And Clara lay awake for a while in the unfamiliar dark thinking about all of it. The forged signature, the dead notary, the $40 she would owe Everett Pryor. and the man in the room down the hall who had crossed a dusty street to sit with a crying woman he did not know, and had then offered to ride 2 days into the hill country on her behalf. She was a practical woman, raised by a practical man in a practical landscape, and she was not in the habit of romanticism. But she lay in the dark and thought about Caleb Dawes' gray-green eyes and the particular quality of his attention when she talked, the way he listened as though what she was saying was worth the full weight of his mind. And she thought that she had never in her 23 years met anyone quite like him, and that this was a very inconvenient time to notice such a thing. They rode back toward Dusthaven the next morning, and the conversation between them on the return journey had a different quality than it had going out, easier and more personal, the way conversation changes when two people have shared something real together. Caleb asked her about the ranch, about how it worked, about what she would need to do to keep it running through the winter while the legal challenge worked its way through the court. Clara talked about it with the detailed competence of someone who had grown up alongside every fence post and water tank on the property, and Caleb listened and asked good questions, the kind of questions that show real interest rather than politeness. "You know cattle," Clara said, somewhere in the second hour of riding. "Some," he said. "You said you were looking for work," she said. She had been thinking about this for half a day and had decided to simply say it directly. "I can't afford much right now, but I need someone who knows what they're doing to help me keep the ranch running while the court case is ongoing. Eli is a good worker, but he's young, and I need someone with more experience for some of what needs to happen before winter." Caleb was quiet for a moment, looking at the road ahead. "I'd be willing to work for room and board until the legal situation is settled," he said. "After that, we could discuss wages." Clara looked at him. "That's not a fair deal for you. Maybe not in purely financial terms," he said, "but it's a fair enough deal for me overall." He said this in a neutral, matter-of-fact way that managed somehow to convey a great deal more than the words themselves stated, and Clara felt color come into her face and looked back at the road. "All right," she said. "Room and board. The bunkhouse is small, but it's solid." "I've slept in worse," he said. "And I'll feed you properly," she said. "I'm a better cook than you'd expect." "I wasn't expecting anything in particular," he said. "So you're already ahead." Clara laughed. It was the first time she had laughed since her father died, and the sound of it surprised her, the way it came up without permission and felt like something breaking loose inside her chest, something that needed to move. Caleb looked at her when she laughed, just briefly, and she caught the warmth in his eyes before he looked back at the road, and she stored that look in some careful interior place and did not examine it too closely. Not yet. They arrived back in Dusthaven in the late afternoon of the third day, and the town registered their return with the same low-level collective curiosity it brought to bear on any development that concerned one of its own residents and an unknown quantity. People noticed. People spoke to one another across fences and across counters. By the next morning, the fact that Clara Hennessy had ridden off to Cedar Falls with a stranger and returned with him 3 days later was general knowledge in Dusthaven, which meant that it was the main subject of discussion in the Silver Horn and in the back of Harlan's store, and over 2 or 3 back fences in the residential quarter. Fletcher Good heard about it by noon. Good was a man of 50, broad and carefully groomed, with silver hair and the kind of face that has been arranged over many years into an expression of confident authority. He received news with a stillness that some people found reassuring and others found frightening. And when he heard that Clara Hennessy had ridden to Cedar Falls with a man who had been asking around about a lawyer, he sat very still behind his large, polished desk for a long moment, and then called for his man, a large, quiet individual named Driscoll, who handled situations that required a different kind of persuasion than the legal variety. What Good did not know yet was that Everett Pryor's challenge had already been drafted and would be filed with the county court in Briarton within 3 days. What he did not know was that Clara Hennessy had not signed a single page of the documents Coombs had brought. What he did not know was the particular quality of the man who had ridden with her. Caleb Doss settled into the Hennessy Ranch with the same quiet competence he brought to everything. He assessed the property with a working eye, identified the most pressing winter preparations, and began on them without being asked, repairing a section of fence on the north pasture that had been sagging for a season and cleaning out the water tank behind the barn that had accumulated enough silt to reduce its capacity significantly. He worked from first light until the light failed, and he worked well, with the focused, economical movements of someone who has done physical labor long enough to stop wasting effort on it. Clara worked alongside him much of the time. She was not a woman who stood apart and directed while others labored. She had been working this ranch since she was old enough to be useful, and she knew every task on it. They fell into a working rhythm that felt, from the first day, as though it had been established over a much longer time, each anticipating what the other needed without much discussion, passing tools and holding things steady, and making the 10,000 small adjustments that constitute real cooperative work. Eli watched this development with the solemn attention of someone who is younger than everyone, but has decided it is his responsibility to form opinions about the situation. By the end of the first week, he had concluded that Caleb Daw was a good worker and a straight dealer, and that Clara smiled more than she had in a long time, and he filed this information away with the gravity of a senior judge and returned to his responsibilities. In the evenings, after supper, Clara and Caleb sat on the porch of the ranch house in the long blue October dusk and talked, or they were quiet together. Both felt equally natural. Clara learned more about him, piece by piece, the way you learn about a person who does not offer themselves all at once but who, when asked, answers fully and honestly. She learned that he had a brother in Kansas City who ran a hardware business and wrote letters twice a year. She learned that he had never stayed in one place longer than 2 years, and had told himself this was because the right place had not presented itself. She learned that he was not a man who went to church every Sunday, but that he prayed in his own private way, and believed in something he could not exactly name, some order or intention behind the ordinary movement of days. She told him things in return, things she had not told people in Dusthaven, because the people in Dusthaven had known her since childhood and had therefore already formed their fixed ideas about who she was. She told him about the fear she had felt after her mother died, the fear that she herself might die before her father and leave him alone. She told him about the time she had nearly left Dusthaven at 19 for a position as a school teacher in Austin, and how she had chosen to stay because her father's health had been poor that winter and she had not been willing to go. She told him that she sometimes read until 2 in the morning because books were the place where she felt most entirely herself, and that this was something she had never said to anyone. "What do you read?" he asked. "Everything," she said. "History mostly. And some novels, though I have to order them from San Antonio and it takes weeks. I've read every book my father owned 3 times over." She paused. "He had a copy of Moby Dick that I read in the winter when I was 16, and I've never fully recovered from it." Caleb smiled at this, the real smile that she was beginning to collect the way you collect rare and particular things. "I read that on a cattle drive," he said. 3 weeks on the trail with nowhere to be at night and nothing to do but read. I borrowed it from the cook, who was an unusual man." What was unusual about him? "He spoke 4 languages and quoted poetry at the cattle," Caleb said, "and they seemed to find it calming." Clara laughed again, and it was coming more easily now, the laughing, as though something that had been locked down tight was slowly finding its way open. The legal challenge was filed in the county court in Briarton on October 28th, and the news reached Dusthaven the same day, because in small communities news of consequence travels faster than the people carrying it. By evening, everyone in town knew that Clara Hennessy had challenged the lien on her property, and that her lawyer was claiming the founding document was fraudulent. Fletcher Good did not respond publicly, Men like Good never did. But Coombs appeared at the ranch 2 days later, arriving in a fine buggy with the springs that spoke of expensive procurement, and stood in the yard and asked to speak with Clara. Caleb was mending a section of saddle leather on the porch when Coombs arrived. He set down his work and watched without appearing to watch. Coombs made an offer. He said, very reasonably, very smoothly, that Mr. Good was prepared to be generous, that he was prepared to offer Clara a sum of money, $250, in exchange for a quiet settlement that would allow the transfer of the property to proceed without the unpleasantness of litigation. He said this was a more than fair offer given the legal standing of the lien, and that litigation was expensive and uncertain, and that Miss Hennessy might find herself in a considerably worse position after a court proceeding than she was in now. Clara stood in the yard with her arms crossed, and her face composed into an expression of absolute stillness that her father would have recognized immediately. "Tell Mr. Good," she said, "that the document he is basing his claim on was signed with a forged signature and notarized by a man who had been dead for 5 days when the notarization was dated, and that I intend to say this in open court and have it entered into the county record." Coombs's smooth expression flickered, just for a moment, just enough. Then he recovered it. Miss Hennessy, making accusations of that nature in a formal proceeding without— "I'm not making accusations," Clara said. "I'm stating facts that my attorney has documented and will present to the court. Thank you for coming, Mr. Coombs." She turned and went back into the house and closed the door. Caleb picked up his saddle leather and resumed his mending, and the small smile at the corner of his mouth was brief but genuine. Coombs stood in the yard for a moment, then turned and got back in his buggy and drove away. The weeks that followed were hard and good in equal measure, the way some of the most important weeks of a life are. The legal proceedings moved at the slow, grinding pace of the law, with documents going back and forth between Briarton and Cedar Falls and Dusthaven, and Pryor sending regular letters to Clara that she read at the kitchen table with Caleb sometimes sitting across from her, and sometimes not, depending on the hour and the work. The nights grew colder, and the days shorter, and the cattle needed moving to the winter pasture, and there were fence lines to check and hay stores to assess, and a dozen other things that required constant attention. And in the middle of all of this practical urgency, something was growing between Clara and Caleb that was not practical at all, or rather, was both entirely practical and entirely not, the way the best things are. It grew in the specific way that love grows between people who are busy and serious and not inclined to drama, not in sudden declarations or moments of crisis, but in the accumulation of small things. The way he always poured her coffee first. The way she always left the lamp burning when she knew he was going to be working late, so he would not come into darkness. The way he listened to her read aloud from her books on the evenings when the fire was going and the wind was high, listening with his whole attention the way he did everything, so that she found herself reading better, more clearly, more expressively, because she was reading to someone who was genuinely there. The way she learned that he sometimes had bad nights, when whatever he carried from the war pressed close in the dark hours, and she learned to leave a pot of coffee warm without commenting on it, just having it available, because sometimes what a person needs is not a conversation about what is wrong but simply proof that someone knows and does not require it to be different. She loved him before she knew she loved him. And then one evening in mid-November, she was carrying a lamp across the yard toward the barn to check on a mare that had been favoring her left foreleg. And Caleb was coming out of the barn as she was going in, and they nearly collided in the dark doorway. And he caught her arm to steady her, and the lamp swung and lit his face from below. And she looked up at him from a distance of perhaps 8 inches, and understood very clearly what had been happening to her for the past 6 weeks. He understood it too. She could see it in his face, that he had been carrying the same knowledge and had been waiting for something, perhaps for proximity and lamplight and the direct evidence of each other's eyes. "Clara," he said, just her name without anything attached to it. "I know," she said. He kissed her then, or she kissed him. It was impossible afterward to say with any certainty who moved first, because they moved at the same time, which is how the best kisses happen. It was careful and warm and not brief, and the mare in the stall behind them shifted and stamped and then settled, and the lamp stayed burning, and the night was very quiet around them. They stood apart afterward and looked at each other with the particular, slightly stunned expression of people who have just confirmed something that changes everything. "I should tell you," Caleb said carefully, "that I have spent the last 6 weeks trying to determine whether what I was feeling was appropriate, given the circumstances under which we met and the situation you're in." "And what did you determine?" Clara asked. "That feeling it was unavoidable," he said, "and that the only question was what to do with it." "What do you want to do with it?" she asked. He looked at her for a long, steady moment. "I want to stay," he said, "if staying is something you want." Clara thought about the ranch around her, the limestone and the cedar and the long eastern pasture and the spring that ran even in dry summers, and she thought about the last 6 weeks and what they had been, and she said, "Yes, staying is something I want." November deepened and December came, and the court proceeding in Briarton was set for the 15th of December. Pryor arrived in Dusthaven a week before, carrying the documentation he had assembled, which included a certified copy of Samuel Crick's death record, a deposition from a handwriting expert in San Antonio who had examined the signature on the lien document alongside samples of Thomas Hennessy's authenticated writing, and a statement from 2 men who had done business with Thomas Hennessy and could testify to his meticulous honesty. Pryor stayed at the boarding house in town and spent his evenings at the ranch going over the case with Clara and Caleb at the kitchen table by the light of the oil lamp. He was a methodical, thorough man, and he left nothing unexamined, working through every possible counterargument Good's lawyers might make and constructing careful answers to each. Good had engaged a lawyer from San Antonio, a man named Halbert who had a reputation for winning cases through sheer volume of procedural obstruction, filing motion after motion, until the opposing party ran out of money or patience. Pryor knew Halbert and had faced him twice before and had beaten him once and been beaten once, and he regarded him with the measured respect of a worthy opponent and no particular fear. The night before the proceeding, Clara sat up late at the kitchen table after Pryor had gone back to the boarding house, and Caleb had sat down across from her with 2 cups of coffee and the particular quality of presence that meant he was available for whatever the night required. "Are you frightened?" he asked. "Yes," she said, "and angry both at once." "Both make sense," he said. "I keep thinking about my father," she said, "about what he would say if he knew that someone had forged his name on a document. He was so particular about his word, about what he signed and what he promised." Her jaw tightened. "He would have been furious." "He would have been proud of you," Caleb said. "For not signing, for going to Cedar Falls, for standing up to Coombs in the yard." Clara looked at her coffee cup. "I was terrified standing in that yard talking to Coombs," she said. "I didn't feel brave. I felt like my knees were going to give out." "That's what bravery is," Caleb said. "Doing the thing when you're frightened. It doesn't feel like courage from the inside. It just feels like not stopping." Clara looked up at him, this man who said things in a particular way, who had thought about them first. She reached across the table and put her hand on his, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and they sat like that in the warm lamplight with the wind moving in the cedars outside, and she thought that she could sit like this, in this kitchen with this man, for a very long time. The proceeding in Briarton the next morning was held in the county courthouse, a proper brick building with high windows and wooden pews in the public gallery that filled steadily as the hour of the hearing approached, because word had traveled and Fletcher Good was a known quantity throughout the county, and people had opinions about the situation. Clara sat at the plaintiff's table with Pryor on one side and Caleb in the gallery directly behind her, and she felt both their presences with a clarity that steadied her. Good himself was present, seated in the gallery on the opposite side with two men in expensive coats who were presumably associates of some kind. He was perfectly composed. He looked like a man who has been in contested rooms before and considers them simply another venue for the exercise of his will. Halbert argued, as expected, that the lien was a valid legal instrument properly executed, that the death records cited by the plaintiff were unreliable given the informality of record-keeping in that period, and that the handwriting analysis was the opinion of a hired expert rather than established fact. He was smooth and forceful and took up a great deal of the court's time. Pryor was quieter and more precise. He presented the death certificate for Samuel Crick, which was not from informal records but from the official county ledger in Dusthaven, signed by the county clerk at the time. He presented the handwriting analysis with a detailed explanation of the specific discrepancies identified. He presented Clara's sworn statement about the H in her father's signature. And then he presented something that Halbert had not anticipated and that Good had apparently not known about. Among the documents in Thomas Hennessy's tin box, which Clara had brought to Cedar Falls and which Pryor had examined carefully, there had been a letter, dated 3 weeks before Thomas Hennessy's death, from a man in Briarton who had served briefly as an associate of Good's Land and Cattle Company and had since parted ways with that organization. The letter was addressed to Thomas Hennessy and warned him that he had seen a document with Hennessy's name on it in the company's files that he did not believe Hennessy had actually signed. The writer said he was telling Hennessy because he had done business with him and found him honest, and because what he had seen troubled him. Thomas Hennessy had received this letter and, Clara realized now with a terrible clarity, had been trying to understand it and decide what to do about it in the weeks before his heart stopped. Pryor read the letter into the record with the measured voice of a man who knows when evidence speaks more powerfully than argument. The silence in the courtroom afterward was very complete. The judge, a compact, white-haired man named Elmore Hatch who had been on the bench in Briarton for 20 years and had seen most varieties of human behavior without being particularly surprised by any of them, sat with his hands folded for a long moment after Pryor finished. Then he looked at Halbert and said, simply, "Counselor, I will hear your response." Halbert made an admirable attempt at one, but the letter had done its work, and the courtroom could feel that it had. Hatch deliberated for approximately 40 minutes, and then he returned to the bench and ruled that the lien on the Hennessy property was void, the founding document having been established to the court's satisfaction as fraudulent, and that the property in question remained in the lawful ownership of Clara Hennessy as heir to her father's estate. He also noted for the record that the evidence presented raised serious questions of criminal fraud and instructed the county sheriff to investigate accordingly. Clara sat very still when the ruling came down, and then she put her hands flat on the table in front of her and pressed them down as if she needed to confirm that the table was real, that the room was real, that this was actually happening. Pryor was writing quickly in his notebook. From behind her she heard Caleb's voice, quiet and certain. "Clara." She turned around and found him leaning forward over the gallery rail with his eyes on hers, and she nodded at him because she could not speak quite yet, and he nodded back, and that was sufficient. On the way out of the courthouse, Good passed close by her in the crowd, and he looked at her with an expression that she was honest enough with herself to recognize as dangerous, the look of a man who has lost this particular contest but has not changed his fundamental nature. She met his eyes and did not look away, and then she walked past him and out into the December sunlight. She knew that a man like Good did not simply absorb a defeat and move on. She knew the county investigation would take time and might or might not produce consequences. She knew that living in the same town with him would require a certain ongoing watchfulness. But she also knew that the ranch was hers, that the lien was void, that the record was now public and permanent. A man who relies on quiet, unexamined deception loses much of his power when the deception is examined in open court and found wanting. The letter in Thomas Hennessy's tin box, the letter her father had received and had been trying to understand when he died, had in the end done the work that Thomas Hennessy himself had not had the time to do. Clara thought about this on the ride back to Dusthaven, and she was not entirely at peace with it. She did not think she would ever be entirely at peace with her father's death or with the time she had not had with him, but she felt something settle, some necessary thing come to rest. He had known at the end. He had known something was wrong, and he had been trying to fight it, and the fight had now been won. She told Caleb this on the road, and he listened in his full and particular way, and when she finished he said, "He raised a daughter who could finish it. That matters." Clara pressed her lips together and nodded and looked at the road ahead, at the limestone hills and the cedar and the wide Texas sky, and she let herself feel all of it without pushing any of it away. Christmas came to Dusthaven with the thin, bright cold of a Texas December, which is not the deep freeze of the northern states, but has its own particular bite. Clara decorated the inside of the ranch house with what she had, cedar boughs and a string of red ribbon, and the small painted wooden figures her father had made years ago and kept in a box in the linen closet. She cooked a Christmas dinner that extended itself naturally to include Eli, who had nowhere in particular to go, and Pryor, who had stayed on in Dusthaven partly to manage some remaining legal paperwork and partly, Clara suspected, because he and Harlan, the general store owner, had struck up an unlikely friendship over their shared interest in chess. Caleb came in from the barn on Christmas morning with snow on his hat, which was unusual enough in this part of Texas to make Clara look twice, and he stood in the kitchen doorway looking at her with snow on his shoulders and that small, warm smile, and she thought that she was going to tell him at dinner what she had been working up to saying for 2 weeks. She did not wait for dinner. She told him after breakfast, when Eli had gone to the barn and the kitchen was quiet and warm and the thin snow outside made the world look carefully preserved under glass. She said, "I love you." She said it simply and directly, the way she did most things without decoration or preamble, and she watched his face when she said it, the slight stillness that came over it, and then the softening. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and put his arms around her, and held her in a way that was comprehensive and careful and warm, the kind of embrace that is saying several things at once without any of them being said aloud. And she pressed her face against his chest, and felt his heartbeat, and the rough canvas of his shirt, and the smell of cold air and cedar and horse and coffee, all the smells that had become the smell of her daily life in the last 2 months. And she thought that she had never felt so precisely and completely at home. "I love you," he said, into the top of her head. "I have been trying to find the right moment to say it, and I've been overthinking it." "You've been overthinking it," she agreed, her voice slightly muffled by his shirt. "Yes," he said. "Stop that," she said. "I'm attempting to," he said. She laughed, and the laugh was warm and complete, and outside the thin Texas snow fell in the bright December morning. The new year came in cold and busy, as New Years on working ranches always are. There were cattle to tend and accounts to settle, and the ongoing matter of the county investigation into the fraud, which moved forward slowly, but did move forward, producing eventually a formal charge against Aldrich Coombs for his role in the fabrication of the lien document. Coombs, faced with the evidence that had been assembled, made the practical decision to cooperate with the investigation in exchange for a reduced consequence, and his cooperation produced enough documented connection between the forged lien and the operations of Good's Land and Cattle Company to constitute a serious legal problem for Fletcher Good himself. Good hired expensive lawyers and fought it with everything he had, and the proceedings would go on for another 1.5 years before they reached their full resolution. but his position in Dusthaven was irreparably altered. The story of the forged lien was public record, available to anyone who looked, and in a community built on the premise of reliable dealing and honest agreement, the exposure of that kind of fraud does lasting damage. Other people came forward with their own complaints about the land and cattle company, quietly at first and then less quietly, and the structure of influence Good had built over a decade began to show the cracks that had always been in it but had never before been visible. In February, Caleb asked Clara's permission to write to his brother in Kansas City, to tell him something about his current situation and his intentions, because he was a man who did things in order, and he wanted his brother to know before he proceeded further. She asked what he intended to proceed to, and he said, very directly, that he intended to ask her to marry him, and he wanted to ask her formally and properly when he had attended to certain things first, because he was not a man who did things by half. Clara told him that she appreciated the care and the order, but that his brother's response was not a condition of her answer, which she was prepared to give whenever he asked. He said he understood that, and that he was going to do it properly regardless, and she said that was exactly the kind of person he was and that she loved it about him, and he said he was glad, and they shook hands on it like two people conducting serious business, and then laughed, and then he kissed her, which was considerably better than the handshake. The letter went to Kansas City, and the response came back in 3 weeks, from a man named Henry Daw who wrote with the same direct, thoughtful quality as his brother, and who said that if Caleb had finally decided to stay somewhere, then the woman responsible for that decision must be extraordinary, and that he would very much like to meet her whenever circumstances permitted. On a Sunday in March, with the first green coming up in the eastern pasture, and the limestone spring running clear and full after the winter rains, Caleb asked Clara Hennessy to marry him. He did it on the porch of the ranch house in the morning light, without speeches or theatrical gestures, simply and directly, holding both her hands in his and looking at her with those gray-green eyes that she had been looking into for 5 months now without ever finding their bottom. She said yes. She said it with her whole heart and without hesitation, and the word came out clear and bright as a struck bell. They were married in April, in the Dusthaven church with the bell propped against the outside wall, with Pryor as witness on one side and Eli on the other, very serious in a new collar that Clara had sent away to San Antonio for. The minister was a quiet man who conducted the ceremony with genuine feeling and without unnecessary length, and Clara wore a dress of ivory cotton that she had made herself over the course of 3 weeks with the help of old Marta Ellison from the dry goods store, who had decided somewhere over the course of the winter that Clara Hennessy deserved more from her neighbors than she had received on that October afternoon, and was doing her level best to correct the balance. Marta had also, in the 6 months since Clara had sat on that bench and cried alone, become one of the people most willing to speak plainly about the injustice of what Good had attempted. She was not the only one. The town of Dusthaven had been slow to move, had stood and watched and done nothing, and some of its people had had occasion to think about that and feel the discomfort of it, and to do things differently as a result. It was not a dramatic or sudden transformation. Communities do not transform dramatically or suddenly. But there was a shift, a slow recalibration, a growing willingness to see the difference between the powerful telling comfortable stories and the truth being spoken plainly by someone with less power and more right. Clara did not carry bitterness about the day they had watched her cry. She understood why people did not cross streets. She understood the complicated calculus of a small community where one man controlled significant resources, and the consequences of opposing him were real and practical. She had her own complicated feelings about it, feelings that Caleb listened to without minimizing, and without offering false comfort, letting her arrive at her own understanding in her own time. What she arrived at, eventually, was something like this. The people of Dusthaven were not bad people. They were people who had made the calculation that the cost of crossing that street was too high, and they had been wrong, and most of them knew it, and some of them were doing something about it now. That was the most you could ask of people, that they recognize their errors and attempt to correct them. Not perfection, but correction. The man who had crossed the street was different not because he was perfect, but because he had not made the calculation at all. He had simply seen what was needed and done it, without weighing what it might cost him, partly because he was a stranger and had nothing to lose, and partly because that was simply the kind of person he was. Clara had thought about this a great deal. She thought the second reason mattered more than the first. The spring of 1879 was a good one for the Hennessy Ranch, which continued to go by that name because Clara had insisted, and Caleb had agreed without hesitation, because it was the right name for the right reasons. They ran the herd through the spring pasture and made repairs to the barn that had been needed for 2 years, and Caleb turned out to be, as Clara had suspected from the beginning, exactly the kind of ranch hand and partner the place needed, someone who knew cattle and horses and land with the deep, practical knowledge of long experience, and who worked alongside her as an equal because he considered her exactly that. Henry Daw came down from Kansas City in June, on the train to San Antonio and then by stage to Briarton and then by horse to Dusthaven, and he turned out to be a broader, louder, somewhat more expressive version of his brother, with the same gray eyes and the same quality of honest attention, the same habit of meaning what he said. He stayed for 2 weeks and talked to Clara about Caleb's younger years with a frankness that Caleb bore with patient good humor, and he helped mend the south fence line without being asked, which made him very acceptable to Eli. When Henry left, he pressed Clara's hand at the gate and said, he needed to find the right place for a very long time. Thank you for being it. He said it simply and without sentimentality, the Daw way, and Clara felt it go right through her. Summer stretched long and bright and full over the Texas hill country, and the cattle were healthy and the grass was good, and the spring ran sweet and cold. And in the evenings Clara and Caleb sat on the porch in the last of the daylight and read or talked or were quiet. And the world had the particular quality that good and earned contentment has, solid underfoot, full of light. Clara knew she was carrying a child in August, when the summer was at its most insistent, and the heat pressed against the windows in the afternoons. She was not surprised, exactly, more confirmed in something she had been quietly aware of for a few weeks. She told Caleb on a Tuesday evening when they were both sitting on the porch with their coffee, and he went very still in the particular way he did when something was moving through him that was too large for a quick response. Then he said, "Are you well?" "I'm very well," she said. "I'm tired in the mornings and I want to eat cornbread at every meal, but otherwise I am well." He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she had not seen before, something that went deeper than his usual steadiness, something that was fully open. He said quietly, "This is the best news I have ever received." Clara smiled at him, the kind of smile that comes from way down inside, unhurried and complete. "I thought you'd say something like that," she said. The pregnancy was uncomplicated, as Clara's practical nature seemed to determine most things should be. She worked through autumn, doing what needed doing and leaving off the things that did not need her specifically. She read everything she could find on the subject, which in Dusthaven was limited but which Pryor, now a semi-regular visitor who had found the town more interesting than he had expected, helped supplement through the occasional package from San Antonio. She and Caleb talked about the child the way they talked about everything, with practical attention and genuine feeling in equal measure, making room in the house and in their plans and in their hearts. Fletcher Good's legal situation resolved itself in November of 1879, when the county court found sufficient evidence to support the fraud charges and assessed a significant financial penalty against the land and cattle company, the dissolution of the company's assets in the county being required as part of the settlement. Good himself left Dusthaven sometime in the early winter of that year, quietly, without announcement, and was not seen there again. Coombs had already left, having received his reduced consequence, and apparently found the atmosphere of a town where everyone knew what he had done to be unconducive to the practice of law. Clara heard the news about Good on a cold November afternoon and sat with it for a while, not feeling the triumph she had imagined she might feel, feeling instead something more complicated and more quiet. Justice had been served, as much as it ever is, imperfectly and slowly and at considerable cost, but served. The land was hers, her father's name was clean, the record was set straight. She went out to the barn where Caleb was working and told him, and he stopped what he was doing and looked at her and said, "How are you?" "I'm all right," she said. "I thought I'd feel something larger, but mostly I just feel like it's over." "That's what over feels like," he said. "It's quieter than people expect." She nodded. She leaned against the barn doorframe with her hands on the significant roundness of her middle, and looked out at the eastern pasture, at the limestone and the cedar and the long, pale winter grass, at the land that had been her father's and was now hers, that was hers and Caleb's, that would be theirs and their child's, and perhaps their children's after that. "I'm glad," she said. "I'm just glad." "That's the right thing to feel," Caleb said, and he came to stand beside her in the doorway, and they stood together looking out at the land in the cold November light. The baby came in March of 1880, in the early morning when the sky was just beginning to lighten and the birds were starting in the cedar trees. Marta Ellison came to help, as she had offered to months before, and she was steady and competent and talked Clara through the worst of it with a matter-of-fact warmth that Clara had not expected from her and would not forget. The baby was a boy. He was small and loud and perfect, and had, from the first moment, his father's gray eyes and his mother's auburn hair, which seemed like an admirable distribution. They named him Thomas Caleb Daw, Thomas for the grandfather he would not know except through stories, and Caleb for the father who would teach him everything he knew about horses and land and how to be a person worth being. Caleb held his son in the gray March morning, sitting in the chair beside the bed where Clara lay exhausted and deeply satisfied, and his face was so entirely open that Clara, watching him, felt she was seeing something she had not been allowed to see before, some final room in a house she had been slowly learning the geography of, a room that had been there all along but that required exactly this to unlock. He looked up and found her watching him, and the expression on his face did not change because it could not. It was all the way open, all the way present. "Hello, Thomas," he said to the baby, very quietly, and the baby, who had recently stopped crying and was at the moment studying the ceiling with the intense concentration of someone encountering existence for the first time, turned his gray eyes toward the sound of his father's voice. Eli, who had been waiting outside with the horses the way you wait when you are 17 and responsible, and are not sure what role you play in this particular event, but you want to be available, knocked on the door at mid-morning and was allowed in, and he stood over the bundle in Caleb's arms and looked at the baby with his characteristic gravity and said, "He looks like Clara." "He has my eyes," Caleb said. "They're too small to tell yet," Eli said, and was not incorrect. Clara laughed from the bed, and it pulled at things that were not ready to laugh yet, but she could not help it. Dusthaven moved around them and through the seasons, and the ranch grew. They added to the herd carefully over the next 2 years, choosing good stock and selling well, building the accounts that Clara's father had begun, and that she and Caleb continued in the same methodical, patient way. They added a room to the house, a proper study where Clara's books accumulated on proper shelves that Caleb built from cedar wood over the course of a winter, straight and solid, and exactly the right size. Thomas grew from a small, loud baby into a serious, curious boy who followed Eli around the ranch with the devoted attention of a student who has found the ideal teacher. And Eli, now grown into a quiet, capable young man of 20, took this responsibility with characteristic seriousness, and taught Thomas the names of the horses and the proper way to hold a rope, and the difference between the kinds of clouds that meant rain and the kinds that only looked like they might. Pryor came to visit twice a year and played chess with Harlan and ate Clara's cooking with the appreciative dedication of a man who lives alone and knows what he is missing. And he and Caleb had long conversations on the porch in the evenings about law and land, and the particular shape that justice takes in the West, where the formal structures of civilization are present but thin in places, and the space between what the law says and what actually happens can be wide enough to lose a ranch in. In the late fall of 1882, when Thomas was 2 years old and steady on his feet and absolutely certain of his opinions on every subject, Clara told Caleb that she was expecting again. He received this news with the same still, deep attention he had received the first announcement, and she loved him for the way he always made space for the large things to be as large as they were. The second child was a girl, born in the summer of 1883, and they named her Margaret Rose Daw, Margaret for Caleb's mother and Rose for no particular reason, except that Clara had always loved the word and the flower it named, and Caleb had said that was reason enough. Margaret Rose Daw arrived in the world with a disposition that was immediately and obviously entirely her own, calm where Thomas was intense, observant where he was vocal, with a habit even as an infant of watching everything with large gray eyes that missed nothing. She and Thomas would grow up into each other's closest companions and most reliable antagonists, as siblings do when they are raised close together on a working ranch, where the world is large and demanding, and the people you know best are the people you live alongside every day. The years built themselves one upon another the way years do on good land, not quickly or dramatically, but with the particular solidity of things done properly and attended to consistently. The ranch grew, the herd grew, the children grew. Caleb grew into the land as though he had always been part of it, as though the thing he had been looking for through all those years of moving from place to place had been exactly this specific limestone and cedar and spring-fed pasture, this specific woman with her auburn hair and her direct eyes and her way of reading, aloud in the evenings with a voice that made the words sound like they were being discovered for the first time. Clara grew into the fullness of a life that had been built deliberately and with love, a life that held grief in it, her father's absence, the years of uncertainty, the day she had sat on that bench in front of the land deed office and cried alone in front of a town that did not move, but held also the particular and irreplaceable truth that one person had moved. One person had crossed the street and sat down beside her without an explanation or an agenda or a need to fix anything, and that one person had become the center of the life she was now living. She thought about this sometimes, about the mathematics of it, how a single decision made by a single person in a single moment can redirect everything. If Caleb Daw had ridden into Dusthaven an hour earlier or an hour later, if he had gone to the Silver Horn instead of the general store, if he had been the kind of person who looked at a woman crying on a bench and then looked away again, which was what everyone else had done, she might have signed Coombs's papers that afternoon out of sheer exhaustion and grief, might have taken the $250 and walked away from the ranch and from the legal challenge and from the truth about her father's signature. The entire thread of things would have been different, but he had ridden in when he rode in, and he had been who he was, and he had crossed the street. She told him this once, on an evening in the early fall of 1884, 6 years after the day in question, sitting on the porch with the crickets going in the grass and Thomas and Margaret inside arguing over something with the comprehensive commitment of children who take their disagreements seriously. She told him what she thought about, sometimes, about the contingency of everything, about that single moment and what it had produced. Caleb listened to all of it and was quiet for a moment and then said, "I think about it too. But I don't think about it as luck." "What do you think about it as?" she asked. "I think I was supposed to be here," he said. "I was supposed to ride into Dusthaven on that particular day, and I was supposed to see you on that bench, and I was supposed to cross that street. Not because everything is determined exactly, but because some things are right, and when you are paying attention, you can feel that a thing is right, and this was. Clara looked at him in the porch light, at the face she knew as well as she knew the lines of the eastern pasture, better in some ways, and she thought about paying attention. About the quality of his attention that had been the first thing she noticed about him, the thing that had made her feel seen in a way she had not been prepared for. She thought that a person who pays that quality of attention to the world will find what they are supposed to find, not by accident and not by certainty, but by the practice of being genuinely present to what is in front of them. "Yes," she said, "I think so too." Inside the house, the argument between Thomas and Margaret resolved itself with the sudden, inexplicable completeness of childhood disagreements, followed by silence, and then the sound of them moving together into some new occupation, conspiring rather than competing. Clara and Caleb looked at each other and did not need to say anything about it. The stars came out over the Texas hill country in their vast, unhurried numbers, the same stars that had been there on that first night camped above the creek on the road to Cedar Falls, the same stars her father had looked at from this same porch for 18 years. The limestone was pale in the darkness, and the spring ran its quiet constant sound, and the cedars moved in the evening air. Caleb reached over and took her hand, the way he had taken her hand on that first night at Pryor's table, turning his palm up to receive hers, and she gave it to him as she always did, fully and without reservation. The night settled around them, warm and complete, and the ranch held everything it had ever held, loss and love and work and memory, and the ongoing, irreplaceable fact of two people who had found each other across 30 yards of dusty street on an October afternoon in 1878, and had not looked away since. Thomas Caleb Daw would grow up to run the ranch alongside his sister when the time came, the two of them as different and as matched as their parents had been, carrying between them the history of the land, and the name of the grandfather who had built it, and the memory of the day a stranger had crossed a street and changed everything. He would tell his own children the story one day, and they would tell theirs, and the story would become part of what the Daw family knew about themselves, about who they were and where they came from, and what a single moment of ordinary decency can build when it meets the right ground. But that is far ahead in time, further than a story needs to go to be complete. This one is complete here, on this porch in this evening, with the stars and the cedar and the spring water and the sound of children inside, and the hands of two people who chose each other and kept choosing each other every day that followed, which is the whole of it, the whole of love, the whole of anything worth having. The night was long and kind around them, and they stayed until it asked them in.